Welcome to MJ Hobby Corner. MJ here. This is another MJ Gaming Spotlight, and this is a video for those of you that don't know that goes over a random rule set in my library and basically just highlight the parts that jump out at me, right, from the rules. And we talk a little bit about the game mechanics, the core mechanics, and the combat section of the game. And if possible, I'm usually integrating an example of a turn so people can kind of see a very brief overview of what a turn would look like and what kind of miniatures could be used, since most of these games that I talk about in the spotlight are usually miniature agnostic. So basically that's a description of what MJ Game Spotlight is. So this week on the Game Spotlight, is Weasel Tech Cybernetic Warfare from Nordic Weasel Games. So Nordic Weasel has given us a new game now, and I purchased it almost immediately when I realized that it came out. You can purchase the game at Wargame Vault. I'll have the link in the description. And basically it's 77 pages. And the book I'll be discussing is a digital file. It's a digital PDF. Good art. It shows mostly artwork depicting mech figures and terrain and this kind of thing. So I really like that when rule books have this integrated in them, because it gives you a lot of ideas on what you can use as miniatures, or what you can use as terrain. So a good inspiration with the artwork. It's campaign based. It is also a solo game, which again, this author tends to specialize a lot in solo war games. This is not a beta version of the rules. If you look at the beginning where the author gives some of his input on the rules, he clearly states this is not a beta version, but an early edition of the rules, meaning we may see more in the future. Okay, and so that's a cool thing. There is a portion of the rules that talks about two-player mech duels, so you can play the game with two players if you wanted to. There are throughout the rules text boxes with plenty of examples and tips. This is something I do like about this author's style, and again, you see that in a lot of this author's previous games. So let's go to page 7, the premise. This jumped out at me. Once you get to page 7, the author describes the inspiration for the game. The inspiration is set on very anime, think Robotech, think Gundams, that kind of stuff. Of course, your mech models can be from whatever you have, basically. They don't have to follow that flavor, but for the rules of the game, that is what the author chose. And this is important because, of course, anime is very theatrical, very dramatic, right? The game is played in campaign setting, as I said. There are missions and then operations. I'll mention those in just a minute. It is a campaign system. There is a campaign system. As you go through the book, towards the end, you will see the campaign section, which is a pretty big section. And then you have an optional social system if you want to add that to the game. It just gives the game a little more flavor. I probably won't be adding it to my first testing of this game, because I want to keep things as simple as possible so I can learn it. And, so character profiles, this comes after the whole premise section. We do get into character profiles. We see the stats for the mechs, and there's mech, but then you have the pilot for the mech as well, so it makes that distinction. Pilots don't have their own stats, but they do affect the way your mech acts, behaves. So, for example, a pilot can evade danger a number of times equal to their experience level. So that's one way that pilots affect mechs, right? But they're not they don't have their own series of stats like the mechs do. Okay, so before I continue talking about the rules, let's just mention what you will need for this game. These are some of the things that I will be using when I play the game. First things first, of course, dice. You need a D10, two D10s, one of which I usually have them in different colors so I can do my percentile rolls, and then 20-sided dice and 6-sided dice. Throughout the game, mostly in the campaign turns, you'll use the D20 and the D10. You can also use D10s as a randomizer, and the direction of the point, because they have that nice little point when you roll it, the direction of the point can give you a random direction. And mostly everything else, combat and everything, uses D6s. So gonna need some markers. I will be using some markers for the blips, the enemy blips, a couple of explosion markers, and of course some dice, real small dice to record armor, but you can use whatever you want to do this. Okay, it doesn't have to be what I'm showing here. These are just some of the things I'll be using. Of course, you need a tape measure or whatever measuring device to keep for movement and for ranges and all that stuff. And you will need some mechs. Now you can use. I'm using here mech from Cav Reaper. I also have a collection of Mech Warrior mechs by WizKids, the old Mech Warrior Dark Age, I think it was. And I removed the mechs from those clunky dials and put them on regular bases. And of course, you can also use scratch builds like I have here. Can use paper models, whatever you want. The game also has villains, which are specialized elites. And so I thought I'd use my Titanicus models to represent like super villains or something. And no, you wouldn't go out and buy Titanicus just to play the game. But basically, I have this available to me, so I will use them. So defenses in the game are things like I would assume artillery pieces, pieces that don't move, big guns, right? So this is what I will be using. I have some bits from Titanicus, the little gun there that's going to be used, and of course any scratch builds. And last but not least, a board, a play surface, whatever you have for that, a piece of felt, whatever you have for your gaming purposes, and of course lots and lots of terrain. So enemy types. When we get into enemies, we see there are 5 types of enemies. Enemies are powered by an AI, as I will mention shortly. Types of enemies include swarms, you got villains, and you also have scanner blips. Ha! So those of you that have played 5 Parsecs Bug Hunt, you know all about the scanner blips. I really enjoy that mechanic. I think it brings a lot of tension, especially if you don't know what those blips represent, right? So, very cool. So, once we get to page 11, all of the stuff that I described is prior to page 11. Once you get to page 11, you start getting into the turn sequences. And this is basically the meat of the game. So, game is played in multiple phases. There are quite a few phases. But as you will see, it's not as complicated as it looks. So during the first player action phase, a player will have 3 different actions that it can accomplish. One of them is a non-combat action, such as interacting with an objective or maybe activating an equipment that the mech may have. Once that is done, then the player can give a movement action or a weapons action, which is of course firing. Here I'm just giving the mech a movement action, and if any enemies are in range after that, I will fire. Now keep in mind that these actions can be done in any order, so they don't have to be done in the order that they are listed. So that's really cool. And there is an enemy mech. So following the first player action phase is the enemy elite phase, Only elite enemies will move during this phase, and they will accomplish their actions in the order listed. So any special abilities will go first, then movement, then firing. There may be other rules to this, including scenario rules. So then we go back to the second player action phase. So again, we're repeating what we did in the first player action phase with another one of our mechs, a different mech. Right after that is the enemy swarm phase, where we actually get to move the enemy blips. So this short clip shows the enemy blip phase, and during this phase there will be rules for how to identify enemy blips, and blips move 3 inches when they're blips. Basically, every player has 3 mechs, and so each of those mechs will get to act in its own phase, and then after that mech acts, the enemies will get their phase to react. And phases for the enemies are divided into either swarms, elites, or whatever. Each of the enemies will act in their own phase according to what they are. So that's pretty interesting. This kind of system usually does give you a lot of action, because as you activate your mech, then your AI activates, and then there's potential combat or whatever is going on. But you're constantly doing something. So that's pretty good. So one of the things that really attracted me about this game is this could definitely inspire a whole new build for me, a scratch build of more anime-like mechs. I could do that. I also have my World War II mechs that I started building, my walkers, and I could definitely use them. We have our own like little mech solo war games, so that was really cool. That's something that definitely caught my eye, that I could use big robots by myself if Julie couldn't play with me. So excellent. Okay, so let's do a combat example just so that we can see what's going on. So in my, this is the first player action phase, and I'm using the blue mech, and the enemy is out back, as you can see. And this is after I've done my non-equipment action, whatever that is, okay? And then I've also done my movement action already, and that's what put me in line of sight to the enemy. So I have a machine gun, and I'm going to use my machine gun. It is an MG5, so that means that I get 5 attack dice. Okay, so the model number of the machine gun always gives the number of attack dice. So now that I know the number of attack dice, I can get ready to attack. Okay, so that's something very interesting about this game. So there is a spread stat with the machine guns, and that is depending on how close enemies are, I can hit multiple enemies with my 1 attack. So since I'm using 5 dice, I can spread it as evenly as possible among the 2 enemies. And so that's a pretty cool thing about machine guns. Another stat to take into consideration for the weapon is durability. So with machine guns, this is the number of times that a 1 can be rolled before it gets jammed. So if I roll 3 1s, that's it. The gun jams. So to get the required number to hit the target, you use range. And so in this case, since the target is within 10 inches, I have a 4+ to hit. Okay, if the target was over 10 inches, then I would need a 5+. Now remember, weapons have infinite range in this game. So I roll 1d6 per shot. Machine guns are less effective against a single individual target. So that's the case here. I only have 1 enemy that I'm shooting at. So what's going to happen is I have to reduce my attack number, which was 5, to a 4, because I get -1 due to the fact that I'm firing at a single target. So this is now the weapons action, and I can get my dice ready and roll them. So notice that I rolled the wrong number of dice here. It's 5 dice. That's only if I were firing at 2 targets. So why don't we take away one of the dice, okay, and keep the 3 hits. So we're going to say we hit 3 times with 4 dice. That's a really good roll. So basically, we're going to say that this enemy is a copperhead, okay, and there are his stats going across. And if we look at the last column, which is armor, we see that it is a 2. So he has 2 armor. So all hits are going to take away armor first before going to any other damage. So he had 3 hits, which means that both armor points are reduced to 0. And then that last hit can now go to structural damage, okay? So I roll on the structural damage table, and we see that the result is flung aside. The mech is actually moved in a random direction 3 inches. So this is when I take my 10-sided dice, okay, and I use the point to determine a random direction. That's the nice thing about 10-sideds, okay? So there it is. Ignore the number. And that's the random direction the mech is going to be flung into, and it is 3 inches away. So that's what I'm going to do. Basically, the explosion flung them aside, and the cool thing is that if there is a small piece of terrain in the way, the mech will actually demolish it as it crashes into that piece. So it'll be nice to have some kind of wreck marker as that mech is slammed into the terrain piece, and put it down as rubble. So that's pretty cool. So enemies, when enemies are attacking, they do have their own little table to determine, you know, depending what weapon they're using, how they're going to attack. Machine guns, they work the exact same way as in players. Okay. Now, here you see 2 tables, and one of those tables is the firepower table. So as you saw earlier, in the player's machine gun phase, the MG5 means 5 dice. Here, it's firepower, what determines how many dice that mech is going to use. So for firing purposes, enemy mechs are divided into swarms and elites, okay? So elites, the table you're seeing now is the elite firepower table, and it tells you just how many attack dice the enemy mech is going to use on its turn, okay? And here's a close-up of that table. We're going to say that the enemy is going to return fire using a beam, right? So if it was the enemy attacking me, we see that it is firepower 2. That means that the enemy mech will use 2 attack dice when attacking my mech. Rockets and machine gun are different, as we saw earlier with the machine gun. This is an example of the rocket table with all the stats. And again, this is an example of the beam table, and this tells us what kinds of modifiers we're going to add to the beam roll, okay? So beams will be anything like lasers or whatever. It's a broad category. So this mech then has beam firepower 2, so it's going to use 2 attack dice in this little example, okay? Now, the attack dice, in order to get the enemy, what the enemy needs to hit us, we go to the player stats, the mech stats, and it's the scream rating. So in this case, the enemy needs a 2+ to hit me. Beams are pretty powerful. Okay, so there we're saying that 1 hit is scored. I remove 1 armor point. Since he had 1 armor, I remove that point. Okay, and the next hit it takes is going to be structural damage. So after a mech loses all its armor points, we're going to keep track of hits very carefully, because all the hits after the armor points are going to be structural damage. So there's this little table here. Now we're going to say that the enemy did 2 hits, right? So if the enemy did 2 hits, in this case, one armor point is removed, the next hit is going to be a structural damage. And so that is the first structural damage hit that I take. And so I have to roll on a table, which you'll see in just a minute. And it's the system malfunction table. And then I just apply the results of the system malfunction to the mech. So in summary, after your armor has been taken away, the more hits you take, the more severe the effects of those hits become. So in general, after the first hit, you're going to start to see system damage, crippling effects, or catastrophic damage if you take 4 structural hits. Mech equipment and tech levels. Now, what's interesting is with a lot of the equipment, it all has tech levels, and you have to, when you play the campaign, you will be doing research on the different tech levels in order to gain those tech levels so that you can get your equipment, right? So I always found that an interesting mechanic in these kinds of RPG style games. So no problem with that. And then the weapon type that I found the easiest for me to deal with out of the other 3 categories was the beam weapons, things like lasers and whatever. So all you're doing there is you're rolling and comparing that number you rolled with whatever modifiers to the screen rating of the target. And if you beat that, you hit, right? As I said, every weapon category is going to hit a little bit differently. So there are rules for that. And it's explained pretty good. After you've played your game, you just go back. There's a few tables you have to roll, and you get rewards, and you get whatever, depending on how you did in the game. Experience levels, your mechs, your characters do level up. You can get new recruits. Certain events may happen, etc. Then we move into the optional social system. As I said before, the social system is just something the author integrated to give much more story value to the game. Now, this is inspired on anime, and as we know, anime usually has pretty dramatic, like, personal stories for the characters in addition to whatever fighting and crazy stuff is going on in the battlefield, right? So that's what the social system, and what I kind of gather, that's what it represents. And it is an optional system. You don't have to necessarily use it if you don't want to. So once we go through all of those things, again, the campaign section is probably the largest section in the book. And that has all the tables and all the steps to go through the campaign section, right? To the campaign portion of the game. And that usually takes place before a tabletop battle and after a tabletop battle, okay? So it's the stuff that happens in between the tabletop battles. You have your combat reference sheets, which are always useful, and I'm glad that this is included in the back of the book. And of course, your like roster sheets for your mechs and all that stuff. The next thing that I want to mention about the game, one thing that I try to include in the spotlights is whether or not a game has good web support. So what do I mean by web support? Web support is when, for example, battle reports on YouTube. Does the game have a lot of battle reports? This is obviously a very new system, so I'm sure we're going to see them, and they're going to come pouring in. But right now, the web support is, for example, Discord, Facebook page. Nordic Weasel also has a small Reddit community. So basically, that's what I consider web support. Anywhere you can go as a new player and ask questions. Friendly community, and a community that is has veteran players that will immediately say, when you ask a question, will immediately post and say, hey, this is how you do this, or this is how this works, or whatever. And Nordic Weasel himself will make appearances, of course, in the Discord. So so that's the point of the whole web support thing when I mention it. Uh, can you get your questions answered about this game, and how much mention of it, how big the community is, etc., etc. I don't go into all those details, but basically, you join their Discord, Nordic Weasel Discord, or Facebook page. There's a 5x6 Facebook page. So any questions you have about this game specifically would probably be on the Discord, unless there is a Facebook page that has or will open up for this game. I'm not sure yet, but definitely Discord. You have a very good support system there. So for a new player, at least for me, that would be very attractive of a game, because I know that I can get my questions answered and not like be stuck and trying to figure things out. So that's very good. All right, so good web support is I'll give it 2 thumbs up in terms of web support, because I know that there's a lot of in the Discord community that I know most. I know that they would answer any of your questions. Somebody will. Somebody will. Okay. And that's about it. So that's all I have. We will have more on this game, hopefully very soon. And we can get a little more involved in the campaign system and the game system in general. So, and who knows? Julie and I can play a duel, her mechs versus my mechs, and we can blow each other up in a future 2-player game. So, very excited that Nordic Weasel has given us this new rule set. Thank you to Nordic Weasel Games for doing that. And so again, this was my spotlight on Weasel Tech, cybernetic warfare. So let's get our mechs ready and go have some fun. Have a good one, folks.